How's everyone on this Friday morning? Long weekend ahead. This is our last Krembil coffee break, and we'll eventually be sharing all these videos on YouTube. Most of them are already on YouTube, which is nice. So you guys can go back and refer to any of these videos if you've missed anything or you need some more clarification or any additional resources that are linked in those videos. So with today's session, I'm going to go over a few design hacks for your presentations. There's going to be a few tips and tricks that you guys can start to incorporate to maybe spruce up or add some flair to your presentations and maybe your presentation style. So the first thing I kind of want to discuss is human perception. So the way that a lot of us work is that, when we like to acquire our knowledge, and when we do acquire this knowledge, we have to process it, right? And then what we do next is connect that to existing knowledge. So when you're presenting, oftentimes you're presenting new data and your audience has to process that data and then also make a connection to what they already know within, and where your sort of results and your research sits and what they already know. We want to make this process as easy as possible when it comes to presenting. So the less confusing and the less sort of all over the place or disorganized or the way that things are presented, the more efficient they're presented, the better it is for your audience to understand and the less likely they are to tune out. So, acquiring knowledge, processing, and connecting it, we want that to be as seamless as possible when you're delivering your presentation. So in a sense, keeping that in mind, our sensory channels compete, right? A lot of people are visual learners, so vision tends to dominate. In that case, what you really want to do is kind of write down what your main points are and find a way to tell a story, right? And Heather and I will always say this, find a way to tell a story, because people latch on to stories, people latch on to that emotional connection if you can find that within your research or what you study. So an example of that would be something like this. So I'm gonna sort of just make up a story here. Say an older person notices that they're having these these shakes or these uncontrolled body movements. They're not entirely sure what it is, so they go to their family doctor, who thinks that it may be seizures. But interestingly enough, that the family doctor can't refer them to someone in their town because there's no neurologist there. They realize that there is a neurology and seizure specialty research going on in Toronto, and these people are investigating things like music therapy and other treatments. So you can see how I've sort of formed a mini story or a little arc that your audience can sort of follow that fits in the realm of epilepsy. And you can sort of use each of these headings to tell about your research, or epilepsy research in this case as my example. So in this case, I've sort of outlined my main points. I found a way to tell a story. It doesn't have to be completely patient specific, but if you are using a specific patient, make sure to get their consent. And this is very easy to follow to acquire new knowledge about, what the current hypothesis is within epilepsy and epilepsy research, and then to connect that to existing knowledge that they might have, or, they might understand about epilepsy as well. So I'll go over some, design tips and some things that can help you when it comes to telling your story and how to clearly tell your story to avoid as little confusion as possible with your audience. So the first thing you kind of want to do is build a template or layout. I find this is very easy because what you can do is, you can use this across the majority of your presentations. Now, of course, depending on the type of, conference, virtual seminar, or whatever you're presenting or where you're presenting, that might have to change. But if you've noticed with these coffee breaks, I've stuck to sort of 2 slide templates. This one here, where I sort of have tips and other things listed, and then my photography slide templates, where I'll show you a lot of images and examples in that case. It's easy for you because you've kind of got something that you can kind of plug and play. You can sort of drop text in, you can drop images in, you can drop graphics in, and you can sort of decide on your color schemes as well. Now, I sort of mentioned this in the infographic presentation where you can use Krembil and UHN color schemes. And there's a whole PDF that outlines that, that I can share again in a document and, you know, a follow-up email blast that goes out to the community. But develop a color scheme, and you can use a resource called Adobe Color, which is great. It's a web resource that shows you analogous colors, it shows you contrasting colors, triads, and it goes a little bit into color theory. And say if you're building a personal brand, you can really develop your own color scheme that can run throughout your content, whether that be presentations or graphics that you create, or you know, slide decks in that case. The next thing I'll talk about is fonts, because fonts are important because they sort of indicate brand trustworthiness. There was a study or a survey in the New York Times, and I believe they surveyed 40,000 people to read an article in different fonts. And they found, I believe that Georgia, if I have my notes here, I don't remember which one it was, I didn't write it down, but one font tend to be perceived as more trustworthy. And the third thing I'll talk about is design elements. So if you've noticed on this slide, it's kind of divided into 2/3 text, 1/3 graphic, with this one here being the graphic. So keep in mind, you know, things like symmetry, rule of thirds, some of the design elements or compositional things that I talked about in photography in that Krembil coffee break session may apply here. So feel free to refer back to that and see how you can apply those design elements when it comes to designing your slide deck as well. So here's some examples. On the left here, these 3 colors are the main Krembil colors. These 6 colors are accent colors. Now what you can do and what is recommended is that you stick to the main colors and then maybe pick 2 or 3 of the accent colors to sort of sprinkle within your presentation. You know, that's if you're giving a Krembil branded presentation or Krembil seminar, you can use those colors. Now, maybe your lab has, you know, their own sort of flair, own color scheme, and reflects your personality and the personalities within your lab. So keep that in mind. Maybe when you're giving other presentations, you can incorporate your own palette, color palette for your slide decks. I show this slide here to sort of illustrate design elements when it comes to sort of the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds in terms of design slides is a bit different than the rule of thirds in photography, where it says to divide your sort of frame into 3 columns and 3 rows, and then where those columns and rows intersect is where you want to put important elements. In this case, it's more so just columns. You can see this slide divided into 3 columns, which is easy to follow and looks visually pleasing. And the last sort of thing here is about fonts. This first font, Meta Pro, is the UHN font for the UHN logo. So a lot of things that are UHN branded will have this font either the logo or in the headings. I tend to use it here in the headings. As you can see, that's Meta Pro. Myriad Pro is the Krembil font. So that's the one that's used for the Krembil logo and a lot of our letterheads and things like that. And this last one, just please don't use this one. This is a play on Comic Sans. Actually, that Times article, one of the fonts that it was presented in was Comic Sans, which was perceived as the least trustworthy. So maybe there's a place for this font if you're presenting to kindergartners that might be excited about science, but definitely try not to use that font. The next tip I'll sort of give is present conclusions. If people wanted to look at hard data, they'd read your article, you know. Present conclusions because it allows people to follow the story that you're trying to tell, right? The less confusing elements or things that they have to process on a slide, the better, because they can follow your voice and they can listen to the story that you're telling about your research. And the best way to kind of do this is infographics. And like I said, you can refer back to my infographic presentation where it shows you the different types of infographics you can create to tell your story. So this is an example here. So this paper is actually from Philippe Monnier, and it's a paper that talks about a visual disease. Oh my God, I forgot. IRD. I'm so sorry. Forgive me that I've forgotten what the disease is. But so this is a set of his data on the left here, pulled directly from his paper. And basically what his paper looks at is a neutralizer for neogenin, which is implicated in photoreceptor cell death in this disease. And what I've done is really taken or summarized this data with this infographic right here. Now, what you can do is with this, you can present individual graphs that you've created on it, like on a slide by itself, and then go into explain that. But think about making it a little more lively. You can use colors to indicate that, you know, say the 41IG treatment and the 41IG treatment plus CNTF, I think that's ciliary neurotrophic factor, shows, you know, an increased thickness of photoreceptor layer, which you can go on and explain that that might mean that these rods and cones are surviving more with these two treatments as compared to our control, which is PBS or just the ciliary neurotrophic factor on its own, right? So that looks a little more interesting, a little more visually interactive. And then you can always complement that with one of these cool fluorescent slides on the next slide, right? You're just like, this is what it looks like in the eye. And then you could summarize all of that by indicating that, look, with this treatment, we might have a potential drug target that could help these patients, you know, either rescue their vision or delay their visual loss or things like that, right? So think about how you can take some of these graphs, which are sort of standard when it comes to, I think, the journals. They might set a standard. I'm not entirely sure. But if you're giving a presentation, you don't need to stick to this sort of black and white totalitarian kind of design. Feel free to design something like this, right? And you know what? For this kind of stuff, you don't need error bars like you see here. And if people in the question and answer period say, where are your error bars? You can send them to me and you can say that Twain told you that you don't need them for your infographics. The next thing I'll talk about is removing unrelated elements. So please, PowerPoint is not a teleprompter. Please don't read the text off your slide. And if you have a lot of text on your slide, people are going to start reading your slides and they're going to tune out to what you're saying, right? If you do have text, make sure it adds to your story. And always ask yourself, you know, can it be visual? If maybe how you design your PowerPoints is you like to type everything out, your bullet points or whatever it may be, maybe start like that and then ask yourself which one of these bullet points could be turned into a infographic or a visual, or where can I reduce the text to that's something that's a little more digestible, or where can I use an image? So I'll use an example that's not necessarily science related. So I built a PC in quarantine, mainly because my laptop can't really video edit and I'm missing my workstation at Krembil. So on the left here, you see I've got a ton of text and a ton of stuff that people might not understand, or they'll start reading and they'll tune out to the story I'm telling them how you know, I built a PC. On the right-hand side, I've just used images to kind of replace the majority of the text. And you can see here that, you know, people that can relate to what a CPU is, what a motherboard is, what graphics are, and what RAM is. And then you can complement that by the products that you used. In my case, the products that I used here. So just think about how you can replace some of your text with images. And if anyone's curious, yeah, these parts are really good for a PC if you're looking at building a PC. But think about reducing your text, because like I said, if people are reading, they're likely tuned out to what you're saying unless they're really great at multitasking and can follow both. The next sort of tip, the next two tips are going to be about text. And what you can do is incorporate contrasting text. You'll see on some of my slides too, the important point that I want to make is always in an accent color or a different color than the rest of some of the other text on the slide. So the nice thing is it can emphasize important things. It can be a bit more impactful than, say, using a bold text or using italics. And it's you know, creates a pop on the page depending on the type of background that you're using. So an example is something like this, right? Do you see how that contrasting text, maybe yellow wasn't the best on a white background, but I wanted to keep in theme with the previous slide color scheme. So you can see how the contrasting text kind of pops out at you, and you can use that for emphasizing important points, right? So when you're presenting conclusions, maybe you want to use text to say that, you know, like in the example with Monier's paper, you could say neogenin promotes rods and cone, prevents rods and cone cell death or something like that. And you could have prevents in a different text or something like that. And this could add to drawing your audience to what your main point is. And then they remember that and they're able to connect that to any existing knowledge that they have and to the story that you're telling. And it makes sense for them, and they can process what you're saying in your presentation. So the next thing is text and backgrounds, right? So if you do have a strong or busy background, make sure to create some contrast between the text that you have on that background. Oftentimes I'll just see like the text placed there in just a different color, but sometimes it might get lost in a different background element. And what you really want to do is create that separation and visual interest. So once again, your audience is drawn to what you're trying to say with your text. So an example here is, in one of my previous sessions where I kind of use this kind of block to create the contrast, and I'll use that to emphasize my main point. What I could do is I could have the text just plain here in the corner where there's negative space, and then the photo of Gelra, right? But it wouldn't pop as much. And it might get lost in some of these light parts of the image here where this is white and, sure, there's dark areas, but it wouldn't stand out as much as if I just put, maybe a black box and have that sort of as a visual element. As you can see, there's a rectangle here, and that comes into play when you design your slides too, and what type of geometric elements you want to include, and how you use that to bring together your slides as well, right? In this case, like I said, I've used the black box here, but the white and the black contrast so much that your eyes are drawn right to that text, and you can see that it pops out. And what I would be talking about in relation to the slide would be how to frame your subject. Right. And so you remember that, and then everything that follows will sort of fall into that bucket, and then you can relate back to it and sort of make that connection. So those are some like 5 tips I think that would be really, really helpful to start with. I mean, there's tons of tips that you could use, and there's tons of tips on the internet that you could find that would also complement and supplement some of these tips here. But I'll go into a few other things that you might be considering as well. A word about animations. Animations, they're really cool. They look exciting. They can be visually catchy, and can engage your audience. And I think, this is my own personal opinion, because design is subjective. I think subtlety is key. Fade ins, fade outs, that's fine. But if you're doing things where, your text kind of like drops on screen one by one, that might be a little bit too much. With the example on the left with sort of the epilepsy story I'm telling, with each element, when you sort of tell that arc of that person that has these, what seizure-like events, you can talk about, that could fade in history of seizure. Then you talk about how they're sent to their family doctor, and the family doctor thinks it might be this, but it might be that. That'd be current hypotheses. And then you realize that, maybe there is a neurologist in their town and they have to go somewhere else. And you're like, okay, well, why can't they fund a neurologist in this town? That could be another sort of fade in. The last one could be also like a fade in or something like that. If things are flying on screen very fast and quick, that could be visually distracting, I think. And again, if people see that, they're going to tune out from what your story is and what you're trying to say about your research. I think it also takes a lot of practice to make these animations look seamless. So I think PowerPoint really does make it easy to animate. I haven't used animations in PowerPoint just because I'm more familiar with the Adobe suite and using animations like After Effects and things like that. But feel free to play around with it and see what works in terms of subtlety, right? And what works to complement your story versus distract from your story with your presentation. And the last thing I'll talk about here is your voice. I would say that this could be a design hack too, because the way you deliver your presentation is part of the design. Think about the tone that you're using. think about how that ties into your research and what you are presenting. Is this something that's exciting and groundbreaking? You know, sound excited about it. Present that with passion and present that with energy. Get the audience excited about it, because the audience will feed off that, right? If they see that you're excited about your work and what you're presenting, they in turn will also have that same interest. And then you can engage in meaningful conversations about your research. And that's ultimately the goal, right? We want to have meaningful conversations about our research and where our research sits in the grand scheme of things within our field, and how it applies to, you know, the population and the world as a whole. And with that, you'd have to practice your delivery. I know that's not always practical because, you know, you've got so many other things on your plate, but take some time. You know, say you have, you know, you've got a conference or a virtual seminar coming up in 3 weeks. You know, take the first couple of days to really design your slides and write down your speaking points, and then take the back end of that week to practice your delivery and how you want to express and tell your story. Because your delivery is also part of the whole design of your presentation. If you're monotone and sort of subdued, you know, people will pick up on that, and they in turn might tune out. I remember having a professor at U of T, I think it was Physiology 300, which is a 3rd year course, and I was excited about neurophys. I thought it would be really cool, but his tone and delivery was absolutely sort of boring and dystopian and just not exciting. So I really tuned out during that class. And I'll admit, it was probably one of my worst marks in 3rd year, just because I couldn't focus in his class based on his delivery. And I wasn't as passionate about the material because the professor didn't express passion in his work and in what he was doing. So you know, it makes a big difference to your audience. So definitely keep that in mind when you're designing your presentations, how you can design your delivery to, you know, be part of your story and your research. So sort of a quick summary here. So in a sense, you know, find a way to tell a story. I think this is a theme that runs throughout all of sort of our coffee breaks, because people latch on to stories, and you know, a presentation is a great way to tell a story about the research that's that you're doing or that's going on, and what you're working on. And some of the design tips, right? Build a layout, find something that works for you, find some color schemes that work for you. And if you're, you know, doing a Krembil specific presentation, maybe you want to use the Krembil color scheme in our branding. Or if you are, maybe your lab has a color scheme and, you know, your own personality, you can develop that using some web resources like Adobe Color to find color schemes and fonts. And sort of just a word about fonts to keep your fonts consistent within your presentations. Even if you are doing different presentations, people want to know that it's your work that you're presenting. So if people see a slide deck, say from your lab, they want to know that it's from your lab. And you can ensure that by keeping your layout consistent and keeping your fonts consistent, because that's part of your overall lab branding, right? The second thing is presenting conclusions. Forget the sort of graphs with error bars and things like that. That has its place in the academic world and for journals and things like that. But think about creating something that's more visually interesting, that's fun, that's playful, that's a little more simpler and for your audience to digest. You don't want to overcomplicate things or present complex visuals to your audience where they have to start crunching numbers and doing calculations in their head. So use infographics in that case if you can. The third thing is removing unrelated elements. And this is sort of the idea of not having a lot of text on your slides. Try and minimize your text where you can. And this sort of goes back to, if you find that you're typing out sentences upon sentences on your slides, go back and think about what you can turn into images or where you can reduce your text. The next thing is incorporating your contrasting text to, you know, have things pop, right? So, you know, maybe you have a statement or a conclusion that you want to write in text. Part of the text can sort of be in a different color, an accent color, if you will, from your color scheme to have that pop on. And that way your audience can sort of latch onto that and visually think it's like, yes, this is an important point. I need to remember this. And then, so the fifth tip here is creating contrast between text and background. If you are using images for your background, ensure that you find a way to create contrast, whether you're using a different color to have your text sit on, or that your text sits part of the image that is not as visually distracting or isn't as busy as some of the other elements. Animations, again, keep them subtle, keep them minimalistic, as I like to say, and practice with it. You know, PowerPoint's, I think, has got a good built-in animator, and practice with some of the animations. And then also your tone and delivery, that's also going to be key. And I think that's something that a lot of people overlook. Like, they'll put together a great slide deck, and then they not really practice the presentation, or they haven't thought of a good way to effectively deliver it. And then, you know, it's kind of, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You've created this good presentation, but then your delivery is not up to par with the other design elements as well. So keep that in mind. The tone and delivery is also part of the design of your presentation and your slides as well. So all in all, right, we want to create these effective presentations so we can share our research. We can have the general public and people who don't necessarily have science background understand our research. And, you know, the easier that people can acquire knowledge and process that knowledge and make connections, you know, the better it is for your audience to know where your research sits, to know what the importance of your research, and how it benefits, you know, the not only the scientific community, but, you know, the population as a whole. So, you know, it's going to take a lot of practice with some of these elements, and it might take a lot of fine tuning and tweaking and getting feedback from colleagues that aren't necessarily in your field, or even public affairs, but find ways and hopefully these tips can help you sort of simplify your complex data when you present it, so that you know, your audience can understand your research easier and more easily. So that's it for me. A quick presentation this Friday, but I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has them.
Great, Twain. Thank you. That was wonderful. Actually, I have learned a lot myself, and, you know, over time, I feel like I'm often going with one particular template, and I come across a few new tricks, and for that year, everything else is kind of revamped. So it's great. Yeah. I really appreciate the tone and delivery point that you had there. I know, just as a recipient or sort of like an attendee in a presentation, I don't know about you, but if anybody has ever sat there and watched somebody load their slides up and they see, you know, 100 slides pop up for a 15-minute session, and you kind of go, so I think really mapping that out, and, you know, not necessarily having your finger on the trigger, going rapid fire through all the slides, that's key.
Yes.
So
I think that's a good point, Carly, that you make. The less slides, the better, actually, because, you know, you're kind of frantic as the presenter, because you're like, am I going to get through this all? You know, and that's where also planning comes into play, right? You want to plan your presentation, because, you know, a 15-minute talk is going to look different than, say, a 1-hour seminar. So that's also something you should consider when designing slides.
Absolutely. And definitely that polishing aspect, because, you know, as you mentioned, when you see someone frantically going through their slides, having somebody actually have to skip them, you know, it just doesn't come off quite as polished. Yeah. And so again, in that preparation, it's really key. We do have a few questions popping up, so I'm just going to go
Sure.
Now. One is kind of a comment, but I think that you can certainly take this. Karen has indicated that the 2 fonts that you mentioned, the Myriad Pro and the, I can't remember the
Meta Pro.
So they're often not available on your basic Microsoft Office software. I know that with the Adobe Professional Suite, it would be. In case anybody's looking to go and obtain those fonts, do you have particular websites that you look at? I know that some free downloads were suggested through Google, but I wasn't sure if you had a preference.
I usually like DaFont. It's DAFONTS, dafonts.com, I think, is a free resource for fonts, which I think you'll be able to find Myriad Pro and Meta Pro in that library of fonts. And those will install like any other fonts, and then it should be able to show up in the drop-down in any of the Microsoft programs. Yeah, so I would check DaFonts, and there's so many fonts there. and you can get easily distracted trying to figure out which ones you like and you want to download and experiment with.
A rabbit hole for sure.
Yeah.
Grace is asking, aside from using PowerPoint, what other program is good for making presentations?
So this program right here, I'll actually, I know this is a paid program because it's Adobe. Oh my God, does it? Hold on. This is InDesign. And so I tend to do a lot of my work in InDesign just because I work in vectors when I design a lot of these graphics, and vector images are infinitely scalable, meaning that this will scale to any resolution of screen when I present, if I have to present in different mediums, or even if I have to export this for, like, say, YouTube or something. I like InDesign just because there's so much more in terms of design and stuff like that. The one thing that I find is a bit trickier to do is animations in InDesign. You can do animations, it's just that they are sort of exported as HTML. So they will create an own web page, and it's timed. So if it's something that, it's something that's a bit trickier to do, I think, in InDesign. And I honestly am scratching the surface with InDesign as I kind of just taught it to myself this year with designing slides. But I like InDesign for slides. You can also use Prezi. I believe Prezi is also another one that a lot of people like because it kind of does that thing where you can create a big, or like a main point and then sub points, and then it like zooms into like a sub point with that kind of animation. But personally, I haven't used Prezi. At least I haven't used it recently. I used to use it in university. But those are sort of some other programs that you can use, InDesign and Prezi. Well, I use InDesign, and then Prezi, I think, is also available. I'm not sure if there's a free version or paid version, but yeah.
Great. You mentioned scalability within your slides for InDesign. I was just wondering, from my end, one of the things that I've started noticing is a difference in how or where you're presenting with your slide size being standard versus widescreen. What would you recommend for presenters, or would you say that individuals should try and have two versions to load?
That's a good question. I think the majority of screens and I think projectors are going to be widescreen. 16:9 is the standard ratio, but it's going to be hard because then you're going to have to rearrange elements on your slides to create that second version, which, to be safe, you can do that. But then it gets tricky if you're really trying to kind of follow design principles. Things might get a bit shifted and might not look right. So you'd have to adjust it even further to make it look a little visually pleasing. But if you want to be safe, create two copies and then figure out how you can sort of retain some of your design elements in that second copy that's not necessarily your standard size. But I think for the most part, most projectors and most places where you'll be presenting will be widescreen 16:9 standard aspect ratio. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's true. You can often ask, depending on the type of presentation that you're doing or where you're going, especially if you're a keynote, it's really great to ask in advance because, there's nothing kind of worse in my mind than, you go and you're presenting and you've got this beautiful slide that you've mapped out, you've used all of Twain's tips and tricks, and then you get the black bars down the side because you're not wide enough.
Yeah. That can be a bit frustrating for sure. And also keep like multiple copies of your presentation, like on a cloud, on a USB stick, on the computer that you might be using, because, I think when you have linked images in your presentations and linked videos, they have to be able to, like, Microsoft PowerPoint needs to source that path to that video or image. So keep everything in one folder, all your design elements. So say you're using a bunch of images, make sure that your PowerPoint file is in that folder, and make sure all those images in that PowerPoint is in that same folder, because Microsoft will sort of, or the PowerPoint will link to that file path for that image. And then if it's not there, you'll get that sort of pixelated preview that you'll see sometimes with PowerPoint.
Great. Next question. It's a question from Adam. So he's asking, did you make all of the cool icons in your presentation, for example, on the epilepsy ring, or where did you find them?
Yeah, so this one here, so this is just circles. So I did this in Illustrator. So I know I'm using the Adobe Suite. I feel like I'm cheating by saying that because not a lot of you, or some of you might not have access to that. But you could do this on Microsoft Word, right? So you can create a circle. So with this, I'll start with this epilepsy circle. So this epilepsy circle is one circle, and there's another circle behind it with a gradient. And you can create that gradient. You can see the gradient behind it. It goes from light to dark, creating that sort of 3D button effect. And then on that bigger circle, there's also a drop shadow. You can add that drop shadow also to your design elements in Microsoft Word. I believe you could do that. And then this is also a circle here, but instead of having a completed line, the stroke, which we call the outline, is just set to dots. So, and then you can change the color of these dots if you isolate them individually, at least in Illustrator. You might not be able to do that in Word, but you can just change the stroke to dots or dashes, so you don't have, you know, a complete homogeneous circle. These are also just circles and triangles made into a shape. So in Adobe Illustrator, you can merge two shapes to make one shape, which is what I've done here. And the same sort of button idea from here is just, this is scaled down smaller, and these are just lines, right? These are just lines I've sort of drawn with my tablet, and same here. So, you know, I think of illustrations as just a series of lines that mathematically line up to make sense visually. And that's one way of thinking about it, right? So even if you look at the head here, you kind of draw it out with even a trackpad. It's pretty straightforward. And these aren't complex, you know, they're 2D images, but you can make it look 3D by adding drop shadows and things like that. And I think Microsoft Word has some good tools to do that.
Certainly, there's a lot of nice presets in there.
Yeah.
So from Karen, she's asking, now that many of our meeting talks are being done and they're online and possibly being recorded, the issue of copyright is something to consider more in terms of using cool pictures and graphics grabbed from the web. Do you have any advice, and what are the rules?
That's a good question. If you're grabbing something from the web, I guess I was kind of taught that you could, if you cited it and cited where that was from, it was okay. If it's a fully copyrighted image, you'd have to get permission for whoever owns that image to use it. I do think and then if you're using it for like promotional or generating revenue, it's a whole other, you know, whole other sort of beast to deal with. Try and use stock images if you can. I think there's a ton of resources or a ton of free stock image sites and resources for vector illustrations, as well as just, you know, regular photos and things like that. So I'm happy to also like link that in some of these presentations when they do go on YouTube, and have those resources for you guys as well. But copyright is tricky, and I think just being mindful and citing where some of your images, if you've not taken them yourself or created them yourself, cite from where they're from in a little sort of in the caption below it, as best you can, if you can include that.
Going back to the images, Adam was asking about if you designed this graphic yourself. So he's asking more specifically, I guess, about the light bulb and the money tree. Did you do that yourself?
Yeah. So like I've created some of these, like the gear stuff I've created like in previous Krembil graphics. So I just pull it from there and scale it, change the color, stuff like that. Yeah, some of these lines I just kind of like using straight lines, and then I curve the lines in Illustrator. But yeah, and some of these assets I've also had in previous like Krembil graphics. So I'll just like, I have a kind of a library that I've built, so I don't have to, you know, like I said, created light layout and template. So I kind of have these sort of templates that I can use as part of sort of my designs and find ways to repurpose things.
Great. So Karen is saying that she really likes your slides, but if students and faculty do not use PowerPoint, then there could be difficulties when you go and give a talk somewhere in which you cannot use your own laptop. Do you have any comments about that?
Okay.
See that if someone has created something on using a Mac, and then they're transferring and trying to load that up on a PC.
Yeah, that's a great question. And cross-platform compatibility can be an issue, but I think the best thing you can do is probably export it to PDF. PDF is readable on most, and you can full screen in any sort of PDF viewer. And I think the limitation you're kind of stuck with is if you've got embedded videos or embedded animations, and that might be a bit tricky to execute because the PDF are just static images, right, with your slides. And I would always ask ahead in that case, if you're unsure, you know, what programs are you able to play Microsoft PowerPoint, or are you able to use Keynote or any other sort of program. But if worst comes to worst, also save an additional PDF copy of your slides just in case no one has Keynote or PowerPoint or one of those standard presenting applications.
Great. Christine is asking, so she's saying this is probably a separate presentation on its own, but can you comment on accessibility needs in design? For example, colors for visually impaired individuals.
Oh, that's a great question. That's a TRI question. That's a, you know what, now you've got me thinking too, and you're right. That is, I think for me, I think I've got to do some more research on that in terms of how to incorporate accessibility, design-friendly elements that are accessible for everyone. That can be a bit challenging, and that's my own lack of knowledge. I don't have experience creating slides or presentations for that type of audience, and I guess that's for me to do some work on and research a little bit. But I think you do bring up a very important point, because you want, you know, everybody in your audience to understand what you're saying and to visually sort of understand also some of your graphics and things like that. So I think I definitely have to do some research, and I think most people should look at maybe finding ways to make their slides accessible for everybody. But unfortunately, I don't have a lot of knowledge in this space, but thank you, Christy, for bringing that up. You've given me a little project to do.
So I will note there is the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, so that's AOTA. And so that's something that we particularly pay attention to in terms of websites, and even a lot of the videos that Twain is making and you might see on Twitter or on Instagram, we're actually now including things like closed captioning, so that not only is it, you know, if there's an individual who's hearing impaired, but you may be in a setting where you can't actually listen to the audio, or, you know, to disturb others. Within AOTA, there are different, you know, you can Google that, and there are different recommendations for things such as, you know, the ratio percentage for contrast. So I know that that's something that the hospital has to look into, say, for wayfinding. So if they're having a white text and they want to have, you know, a UHN blue behind it, it needs to be a certain percentage in difference, so that if somebody does have some visual impairments,
Right,
it's contrasted enough so that you can see it. So certainly, you know, that's something that we can all probably take back and look into. And then there's even more specifics. Michael Reber is actually a really great individual, one of our scientists in the vision group. And so he actually has different settings based on different visual impairments and the contrast and the colors as well. So I think it's also knowing your audience, but also as a general sort of setting, ensuring that you have those contrasts. And then, sometimes just pictures may not be as appropriate depending on your audience. So certainly a great point, Christine.
Absolutely.
So I'm just trying to pull my chat back up. So Adam, Victoria, sorry. She's making a comment to Adam saying that, just a note, that icons for Pixabay has a great free stock images as well as 2D icons and vector images. Noun Project is another great resource for 2D icons like this as well. If you don't have time to create them yourself, this is what I use.
Yeah, the tons of resources, and it's becoming increasingly easy to design things, right? And definitely make use of those free resources, because those are all royalty free, and I don't think you have to state you know, copyright infringement or anything like that. Or so
So I think Adam's wanting to go into Illustrator and start designing a few things. There's a little more interest on this. Maybe this is a fall session coming up.
That's going to be a whole web series.
So just a quick question to start things off, though. He's asking, are there any good resources or quick references you recommend for getting started with Illustrator? Or is it really by using this over time?
So I think what I started with Illustrator, and oh my gosh, I remember when I got hired in public affairs, I was purely Photoshop, and I really didn't understand vector versus raster. And then I realized that a lot of the Krembil graphics were done in Illustrator. And so I found a resource on YouTube. I think it was like everything you need to know in Illustrator in like under an hour or something like that. And it was a really great resource to take you through the basic tools of Illustrator and how to start designing right away, right? Using, you know, the pen tool, using, you know, shapes, using text and things like that, right? I think YouTube, might even have playlists for, you know, everything from a beginner introductory level to, you know, advanced stuff in Illustrator and things like that. So that's where I started, honestly, picking up certain things from YouTube. And then obviously over time, realizing how to use like gradients or how to create drop shadows or, you know, stuff like that. But it's a mix of both, I think. And YouTube's a great place to start.
Great. We have another comment just indicating it's an excellent point about building a library.
Yeah.
I've put up a collection of my own illustrations and photos, as well as Creative Commons photos to pull from, and it saves a lot of time. So
absolutely.
There. We have a quick little trick from Adam. He's indicating that as a quick test for accessibility in an app development for colors and visuals, is he actually turns his screen to grayscale to see if what he's normally seeing is still being emphasized or if anything is being washed away. So that's an excellent tip.
A great point. Yeah, thank you. I'll do that before I, maybe when we start these sessions back up, I'll make sure the contrast is good and put everything at grayscale.
Excellent. I think that's our last question or comment. We're going to move over to our mug draw. And if anybody has additional burning questions, please type them in now and we'll return to those after. So over to you, Amy.
Actually, I have a question myself.
Okay.
So Twain, you had mentioned in one of your slides to present conclusions.
Yes.
And to avoid being data heavy, because that has a place in the academic world. But what happens if we're creating a presentation for an academic conference or an academic audience? I think as a former graduate student, one of the things that we would do is we would try to cram in as much data as possible on every single slide, because we're proud of our work, but also because we want to be credible, right? We don't want to draw a conclusion without having that data or science to back it up. Because oftentimes if you don't include that data, then somebody will ask, well, how can you draw this conclusion? So where do you find that balance in having the simple to read slides, but also being credible and you know, not looking like I'm a bit light on that research aspect? Yeah,
that's a great question. I think, you know, I probably should have mentioned this too, but you state like knowing your audience, right? If you are presenting to an academic group, maybe you are going to consider using more graphs. But like I said, the graphs don't need to be the same ones from the journal. You can definitely use multiple graphs showing your different experiments or multiple charts or tables or infographics that illustrate different aspects of your research paper. You know, there's so many different experiments that you'll do. And you want to find a way to highlight the important ones that really lead to your conclusion. And so if you can sort of use the data or transform that data even into, you know, multiple infographics, that's okay too. You know, maybe you don't want to use just one infographic to summarize your entire paper, but multiple ones that are in direct relation to your results and findings. And I mean, I think it is finding that balance, you know, knowing what looks good, but what also delivers accurate information and the important information. So I think it takes practice to really figure out what works. And, you know, maybe what you can do is, say you go to an academic conference and maybe you're with your lab or people from your lab are there, and you can have someone sort of maybe take notes to see what works or what they found was helpful within your presentation, or areas where they got lost versus areas of clarity or things like that. And even in your head, if you can make a mental note of those things as well. And then, you know, as you do more presentations, you can sort of refine things, change things, and really polish it up to, you know, this is what I'm going to do to an academic conference versus this is what I'm going to do to a donor, or this is what I'm going to present to a donor. So, yeah.
Thank you. So I do have our little helper here ready today. We've got all the names in this little trusty little cup. So I'm going to ask Ellie to draw one name, draw one sheet of paper, one. Okay, so let's see. It looks like it is, sorry, I'm gonna read it for you. Anhar Al-Husseini.
Congrats.
Congratulations. So I think, yeah, Anhar is here. So congratulations. You can be in touch with our office, krembil@uhnresearch.ca, and we can make arrangements for getting you the limited edition Krembil mug.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Amy and Ellie. So this is our last session. I think we've gone about 11 or 12 weeks, and Twain and Heather are well deserving of a little break. I know it's a lot of work to put this together. And of course, with anything that you're doing for a first time, there's always a lot that takes in the background to go into this. So I'm going to pass this over to Twain for closing remarks. And maybe you can just let everybody know what we're planning to do with these videos.
Yeah, so it's been great having you guys here tune in every week to these sessions. I really hope that you found them helpful and you can take some of our tips, whether it comes to presenting your work or some of the media related tips that Heather has given and some of the design tips that I've given, and really help communicate the good work and the cool research that you guys are doing. We are planning on making a YouTube playlist with all these sessions. So this one will likely be up today, and part of that playlist where you'll find all the other Krembil coffee break sessions. And we're planning on making that public. So you guys can definitely refer back to any one of these sessions and then share them with any one of your colleagues, your lab mates, and whoever you want to share them with, and maybe they'll find it helpful as well. Like I said, I hope you guys have enjoyed it, and I hope everyone, also has a good long weekend and enjoys the rest of the summer, and maybe we may come back in the fall. We're not sure yet.
So once again, thank you everyone for tuning in every week with us. Have a great August. Enjoy the beautiful weather while it lasts, and we really look forward to connecting with you again in the near future.